Okay, super. So, Hugh, we're going to talk a bit about your latest edition of the World Atlas of Wine, and you're the world's best-sold wine writer.
I've been at it longest.
But can you tell me a bit about how you started? Because your first wine book was Wine, which you published at the tender age of 27. So what was it like as a young wine writer, and how did you get started?
Well, I suppose the term wine writer did exist then, but there were very few of us. There was some marvellous characters: Cyril Ray, Raymond Postgate, Eddie Penningrassel. Not many people think they could thought that they could earn their living at it, and I suppose that is still the case. I started because I started travel writing really, and I was a general copywriter on Vogue. So I worked with, my first gig was Condé Nast, and I was paid £12 a week. My rent was £4 a week. I've got a lot of that stuff in. And I just thought that in Vogue there could be an article about wine, because I loved wine and knew a little bit about it. But if you want to, as everyone knows, if you want to learn about a subject, you write about it. That was the Christmas issue of Vogue in 1960. And then I got more involved with Condé Nast, and the chairman was a chap called Harry Oxall, lovely old gentleman. He actually started the English edition of Vogue, I believe. Oh. He was a great Burgundy fan, and he was friends with André Simon, who started the Wine and Food Society, who was then in his 80s, and I was in my 20s, but we met, and we really got along. He was a wonderful old character with a sort of Maurice Chevalier accent and a halo of white hair, and a very warm. And I can still remember shaking hands with him. It was such a big, warm hand. So, in order to help André, who'd started a little magazine called Wine and Food, Harry Oxall asked me if I would edit it, really. So I became an editor at the tender age of 23, I think it was, which was wonderful because I met, I found writers, I met writers, and I was plunged right in, and realised that after reading all that I could find, that I wanted to write my own book, because I couldn't find the book that really told me how to enjoy wine. There were history books, there were geography books, there were not many of those. Everything was very sort of laborious and old-fashioned. I'm not saying there weren't good wine writers, there were, but there was nothing current. If they mentioned a history, it was Louis XIV. So I got really keen on the idea of writing my own wine book, but I wanted an advance, but I couldn't afford the research. And I went around 2 or 3 publishers saying, this is my plan, could I have £1,000 advance? And they said, oh, what, £1,000? An advance for a wine book? You know about wine or don't you? So I was then on the Sunday Times, part of the time. I asked my friend Mark Boxer, who just started the Sunday Times, the first colour supplement, any ideas, Mark? And he said, yeah, I've got an idea. Robert Carrier has just published the most successful cookery book of all time, the first coffee table cookery book, called Great Dishes of the World. He said, go to my friend Jocelyn Baines, Thomas Nelson, who published that, and say you want to do the wine equivalent. I did, and we agreed, and he gave me my £1,000. I set off researching, and the book came out as sort of uniform with Great Dishes of the World, so that needed full colour plates, which I provided, my little Rolleiflex, or rather Judy's little Rolleiflex.
Nice.
And we set off. Unfortunately, it was the vintage of 1965, which, if there's ever been a wetter one, I don't know. We went through Portugal, we went through Spain, we took a ship from Algeciras to Naples, because there was you say, why didn't you drive through Spain and across the south of France and down to Italy? I would say practically there wasn't a road.
Oh gosh.
There were certainly no motorways, so the only thing to do was to go by sea. Unfortunately, some of my best photographs were stolen in Portugal. I still feel angry about it. I'd taken wonderful photographs of the Douro when it was all ox carts. And I can still hear the creaking and the screaming of those great wooden wheels as the oxen towed the thing up the hill with pipes on board. All this was absolutely real then. That's where I started, in the Middle Ages, really, as far as wine was concerned. Anyway, I did my research, I came home, I wrote the book. It came out in 1966. It was very nicely produced, I'll say. Probably good photos too. And it was very well received. People like my sort of cheery way of writing, I think. And I had done quite a bit of research, and a lot of first-hand stuff in it. So it was different from most of the books of the time. And it was not a living, it gave me a great break, but I had to go back to doing some work. And I went back to the Sunday Times, and then Harry Evans, who was editor, to my amazement, asked me to be travel editor in succession to a very famous long-standing travel editor, Elizabeth Nicholas. She'd been doing it for so long she could go to Brittany for the weekend and make 3 stories out of it, but I hadn't. So each week I had to produce a new story, and I hadn't been anywhere really. So I was leaping all over the world. At the same time as we had our first daughter, Lucy, and it wasn't ideal for the young father to have to catch planes all the time. I did it and loved it for a while. I went to places that nobody went to at the time, which would you believe at the time included the Caribbean.
Wow.
Croatia. I think my article on the Caribbean was one of the first on it, as there were no tourist hotels then. It made you realise how much time has passed. The only guidebook was Paddy Lee Ferber's book, The Traveller's Tree, and he talked about these colonial houses where you might be able to stay, but it was wonderful. I was in a critical state with having to travel, having our first baby and everything else, when out of blue sky, Jocelyn Stevens asked me to go and see him at Queen. He was then the editor and owner of Queen magazine. And he said, Hugh, I'm going to do a supplement on South Africa. I'd like you to go and do it for me. I said, yeah. And he said, you'll go with John Hedgecoe, who's our staff photographer, who became a great friend. And just before you leave the room, he said, would you like to edit this magazine? Wow. I said, well, I'll tell you when I come back.
Smart answer.
It was while I was editing Queen that James Mitchell had just started his little publishing company, Mitchell Beasley. He had been at Thomas Nelson when they published my first book. And he rang me up one day and he said, Hugh, what about, do you think there's any relationship between wine and maps? It seems, there are all these different places it comes from. I said, relationship? I said, wine is liquid geography, after all. And he said, oh, I said, why? And he said, well, we've been asked by our backers, who were the map company Phillips, for thematic atlases. And the first one he did was, modestly enough, the Atlas of the Universe. He got Patrick Moore to write the Atlas of the Universe, which was a huge success. There was also the moon landing at that very moment, 70. And Patrick wrote this book as well. And James cunningly realised that the NASA photographs were public property, he didn't have to pay for them. So he rushed out this Atlas of the Moon, which was an incredible success. Wow. So he had the money to do serious cartography, and that is the key. Because anyone who knows my World Atlas of Wine knows it has Ordnance Survey standard maps. They're terribly expensive.
Yeah.
But they're totally convincing. You know you're looking at the real thing. That is the way the fields are, the villages are, the land is, the contours are. There's no flanneling around. You can't write sort of "here be dragons" over it. You either know it or you don't. And it took. It didn't take as long as you might think, actually. It was some of it. 50 years later, I can admit that a bit of it was fudging. Because, for example, the latest survey of the sherry vineyards around Herod had been done in 1914. Mind you, the contours wouldn't have changed very much. And there was none of the vineyards of the Douro. They didn't exist. So I took a contour map, and I thought, well, where are the vineyards? I don't know, nobody told me. So I sent it round to all the shippers, and I said, could you show me where your vineyards are? No reply.
Oh.
I mean, they weren't used to that kind of searching question. So well, there's only one thing to do. So I took a coloured pen and I drew in vineyards where I thought they would be. And then I sent it out and said, please correct this map of your vineyards. They wrote back saying, fine, yeah. So that was the authenticity of that particular map. But that was an exception, I must say. But I went to the Office International du Vin and said, tell them what I was trying to do. And they said, oh, interesting. Yes, somebody else had that idea in the 1950s. And we turned it over to the Portuguese. They thought they would do it. And they said, here's the file. And they produced the file with one piece of paper in it. So I said, well, thank you. Yes, I don't think there's much competition.
I'm fun. So when you started researching the very first edition of the World Atlas of Wine, this was 1960s London. Can you tell me a bit about what the wine scene was like then? What were people drinking and why did it inspire you? What was exotic to kind of go to Portugal? Where were the countries that you were interested in visiting?
It was very, very square and traditional. And as everyone knows, the sort of layer cake of the classes in England means it's very distinct. There were the West End wine merchants, the usual St James's Street suspects, and they had their usual, the clientele you can imagine. So that was the upper class taken care of, and what they drank Bordeaux, basically. And still do.
That's true.
I mean, I belong to a club in St James's, even on the wine committee, and I think 80% of all the red wine we drink is Claret. People are not interested in exploring. They could well afford to, but it's frustrating. But on the other hand, why sort of prod people to do things that they're not in the habit of doing? So there was that layer, which was totally traditional. There were one or two real enthusiasts. There was Peter Dominic, who was there. Was it Paul Docher, I think, was in charge. Was it Paul as well? And they started the Wine Mine, which was a nice little sort of chatty magazine come wine list, which in a way was perhaps the predecessor of the Complete Imbiber. No, I think the Complete Imbiber was there. That was an anthology of pieces, not just by wine writers, but by anyone that they could get to write, which was started by Gilbey's. It was actually my wife's half-brother, Jasper Grinling, who started that. I'm not quite sure what year, in the 60s. And then Cyril Ray took it on, and it got grander sponsors and became a splendid book. So there was that undercurrent, the sort of literary undercurrent. There was the high street undercurrent, and people like Peter Dominic, and there were others. I just can't think of all the names. There was Edward Roche in Shaftesbury Avenue, and blah blah blah. I mean, there were obviously, And there was Tommy Layton, who was a big influence. He got Michael Broadbent going.
Ah.
And funnily enough, 1966, which was the year of my book Wine, was also the year that Michael restarted the wine sales at Christie's. So there was a sense, there was a feeling that time was ripe. Once I'd been given the germ of the idea that we could have really pucker maps of wine regions. Of course, I ran away with it. In fact, I've still got a sort of foolscap notebook in which I sat down that very evening and did a world atlas of wine. I said, we need a map of the world, we need a map of Europe, we need a map of France, blah, blah, blah. We have to do Burgundy, Bordeaux, Rhone. Covered the pages, little sketch maps. It would be nice to have some labels to show what the wine looked like as well. And pictures, and how much would I need to write. So I sketched the whole thing out. And that's really, and we followed it. Judy is a graphic designer, and she sketched out the basic layout of how the text and maps and everything else would fit in on the page. And I'm sure I was inspired by being a magazine editor and thinking in terms of spreads, and thematic spreads, and that's what you do in magazines. So I sort of put that in. And anyway, it worked famously.
So, also in the 80s, you started doing a TV series, I think it was called Vintage, and visiting different wine-producing countries around the world. Last night I watched your episode on Georgia and drinking a wine from a buried Qvevri, and love that you describe it with guts, you said. Do you think that wine...
Being polite, that was.
I imagined. Do you think that wine production is cyclical in nature? Do you think we return to trends? I mean, the Qvevri wines are obviously a hot trend at the moment. Yeah. Even in regions outside of Georgia, they're experimenting with old clay amphora and earthenware. Do you think we return to trends, or do you think as a wine industry it's better to kind of progress and adapt?
I think the answer is that this is the first era where winemakers have ever had the money and the leisure to explore. You had to follow the recipe before this, and if you were fortunate enough to have to be in Burgundy, fine, you could make a living, but most people couldn't. And now wine has become, a global commodity, and much more than a commodity. I mean, it's become all the glorious things that it is, thank goodness. There's a lot of money around, and the universities have progressed the science enormously. New generations been to school instead of just doing what Dad and Granddad had done. And obviously people are curious and impatient and want novelty, introducing new ideas. So they'll get there. I'm sure the new ideas will keep coming. Some of them, like Qvevri's, inspired by old ideas. Because when I saw it going on in Georgia in 1987, I think it was, I was fascinated. It was gutsy, but the science of it, how did it happen, and that principle of putting wine in a great big dolia, as the Romans called them, in the ground, had been going on since the Romans, before the Romans. So it had to be tried out, and the scientific explanation. I'm not sure that lots of brave people are doing it now. What they're actually adding to that wine, I don't know, apart from a splendid back label.
That's true. And you're one of the few people in the world who's had the opportunity to try very old vintages. And by very old vintages, I mean that you've tried wines from the 16th century. Can you tell me a bit about your experience in trying old vintages, and whether you think as a wine industry or world today we've lost the art of waiting for wine? Do you think there's a perfect moment to drink a wine, or a perfect age for a wine, or do you think we should just enjoy it when the moment's
Well,
right?
you don't have to wait 450 years.
I hope not.
It wasn't a very good idea. Although, what was miraculous about that there were 2 bottles of this 1540 Stein wine in the cellars of the residence in Würzburg, that great building with a Tiepolo ceiling. And one of them came into the hands of wine merchants Ehrmans in Mayfair. And Rudy, what was his name? Oh dear. Asked André Simon if he would like to taste it. And a group, a very small group of people who were writing about wine. I think Cyril was there, and there were about 7 of us, I suppose. And Andre brought me along, I suppose. And this tasting started with 3 different 19th century Rhine wines. There was Johannesberger and Markerbrunner, something like that, of the middle 19th century. And once we'd sniffed them, we just said, "No, thank you." I mean, when wine can be, when it's gone bad, you don't want to go near it. So we approached this wine that was 300 years older with a certain amount of skepticism. But we had this tiny little glass, and there was no question it was alive. This was not a dead wine, this was a living wine. Not for long, and it was Madeira-ish, obviously. It was kind of somehow German-ish in a way, hard to say. And we sipped it, and there was the glow on the palate, certain sweetness, depth, really fascinating, and then it was gone. The wine died. But what fascinated me was that this was a substance that had been alive for over 400 years. This would have been normally quite old enough when Shakespeare was born. And it was the son of that extraordinary summer. It's on record, 1540 was, the Rhine dried up. That ripeness, the energy of the sun in that summer was still in that bottle. And that's magic. It's simply magic.
Absolutely. It's interesting, you've just talked about that very hot summer of 1540. Yeah. In your latest edition of the World Atlas of Wine, you've got it in the introduction, a nice overview of the changing climate and the fact that harvests, you've got some good graphs showing how harvests have changed from much earlier dates. What do you think will be the greatest impact of climate change in the wine styles, or perhaps the wine regions that we will see in the future?
Well, I think we're all interested, but some of us are worried. You've got to define, where were the world's greatest wines made in the first place? Where was the definition of great wine? Well, it was in France, and possibly Germany, conceivably Hungary in Tokai. But Italy didn't make great wine, Spain didn't make great wine. I mean, it was excellent sherry. That's where it happened in France, basically. Why? Because those regions have that precise marginal climate. They've also got the appropriate soils of different kinds, but it's that precise marginal climate where there's a long enough, it's a reasonably safe flowering period when things don't get washed away or frosted, and a long enough ripening period. So the grapes get ripe just at the moment when it's cooling off. September, October then. So nature has provided the right scheme for grapes, and then as they're picked, they're not getting boiled, and the natural process ends up with wine that is hopefully stable and hopefully in balance in good years. I mean, in bad years it just didn't happen. And those wines occasionally had qualities which we know could go beyond beauty, just something extraordinary. So they got their reputations, and they built on their reputations, and Burgundy became Burgundy, and Bordeaux became Bordeaux. Then their conditions have been reproduced as closely as possible around the world. in the New World. And one of the first things they needed to do was produce the autumn chill, which doesn't happen naturally in New South Wales. Therefore, the introduction of refrigeration was absolutely key. And in my history of wine, I've researched this. That it actually was first used, I believe, in Algeria, because there were butchers there who were using chilling equipment. And so there were these big chillers, and some, I'm not quite sure which wine man, thought, interesting, I'm picking all these very ripe grapes into a very, very hot climate, and they're going bubble, 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 and I'm losing all the potential quality. Try them chilled. And that took a long time to sink in. In fact, believe it or not, when I first, in California, I first met Andrei Chelistchev at BV, he told me that when they bought the first cooling equipment in the Napa Valley, and they hid it behind the door because they didn't want other wineries to see what they were doing. That was the biggest single sort of scientific advance, if you like, and everything stems from there. So you could grow grapes in climates that were too hot for fine wine and hope for results. You could have had a miracle, in a perfect vintage in the Napa Valley without any artificial aids. Anyway, that's where fine wine started, and those are the conditions you've always needed for it. And if you could reproduce them in some other region, well, great, and you can now. And so the future will be either redefining fine wine, which is what's happened in the Napa Valley. The Screaming Eagles of this world are a new definition of fine wine. I mean, to me, they're wine for cigar smokers. You used to make the cigar with the wine. But that crucial, critical, harmonious, just right balance between the ripeness, the acidity, the tannins, and everything else. If you want that to happen naturally, it can only be done in a very few places. So mapping them was essential.
Absolutely. Interesting. Really nice point. And then commercially, we're also seeing a very big change in the wine world as well. A big change in the climate of the wine industry. What do you think? What's your prediction for the next kind of 10 or 20 years? I mean, we're seeing China and Russia increasing in plantation and consumption, and then we're seeing some of the kind of great older wine countries, France, Spain, Italy, reducing their production and consumption. How do you see the axis shift?
Yeah, well, on the consumption business, it's high time they reduced their consumption.
Really?
The amount they were drinking in France was absolutely spectacular. I mean, there was a case when I was in Paris in the 50s of a building labourer being hauled up in front of the beak for habitual drunkenness, and the beak said, well, how much do you drink in a day? The chap said 16 litres. Beak said, what? How much do your mates drink? And so he just got them, the average was 10 litres a day.
A day, wow.
This was Gros Rouge at sort of 9 degrees. So they were perpetually plastered. But then, where we are so sober today, our ancestors were squiffed all the time. I mean, schoolboys drank small beer, and I asked a brewer friend, what's small beer? And he said, about normal. So, yes, when you think that William Pitt the Younger always had, he drank 2 or 3 bottles of port a day, and he always had a bottle of port beside him in the House of Commons. So they took their decisions in elated state, I would say. But they got away with quite a few too.
We might do better if we have.
I was just wondering if the bar should stay open.
So do you think we'll see consumption continue to drop? But do you think in terms of production, do you envision your atlas being very different? And
Oh yes, I mean this edition, which is led by Jancis. I mean, this is, I am sort of stepping further and further back. I've been working on this book. Well, 71 was the first edition. I started work on that 2 years before, so it is in fact, it's exactly 50 years I've been working on this book.
fabulous.
So obviously the everything's changed. There's a wonderful stability. The map of the Côte d'Or looks very much the way it did. The future is obviously racing on because, now Asia is thinking wine. Well, I mean, we're outnumbered, aren't we? It's Chinese wine. There's I don't know if you've seen a book called Chinese Wine Renaissance.
By Janet.
Yes, yeah. Which is fascinating. I mean, the ancient Chinese wines were made from rice, but they had qualities which were appreciated and talked about. So that's in that sense, Renaissance. I've never understood how the wines we know are supposed to go with Chinese food, the way the Chinese serve it.
Spicy.
Well, not just that, but the thing comes round, and you have a piece of duck and a piece of pork and a piece of fish, all in sort of sequentially, and you can't choose a wine for that. My answer is champagne.
Oh, I think champagne's always a good answer. Super. And then moving on to my last question, really about writing. So one of the things that I particularly love of your writing, and which many people have commented about why you're such a great writer, is that you manage to spin both romance and feeling and experience, as well as science and information. And you've been quite outspoken and critical of debasing wine to points and this kind of simplistic Parker idea of wine communication. Obviously, we've seen wine communication change quite significantly. Do you think the reader has been part of the push for that change, or do you think it's come from the communication side? And how do you envision wine writing in time to come? Because obviously we've now got AI starting to get involved in writing. How do you see the future of wine writing, and what do you hold sacred?
Okay, start with what I did when I started, because that's all I know really. As a writer, whether I'm writing about wine or anything else, and by the way, I write just as much about gardening and plants and trees as I do about wine. I think of the reader, that is, that if there is a secret, it's simply I'm talking to you and I'm writing you a letter. And if you get buried too deep in your subject, then you're going to write academic stuff and you can't expect very many readers. There will be some and they need you. But if you want to sell a lot of books, you've got to think about the reader first. As simple as that, and approach the reader in a cheery fashion with having done a bit of research. And away you go. But as to the future and what's happening now with, above all, with the internet, is that an infinite amount of information is available. It's not providing the information, it's organizing it that people, that writers must do. It's finding ways into this great morass of you can know everything, but how much do you want to know? And I remember in 1959, there was the great vintage. It was the first vintage that got onto the front page of the New York Times, and I remember I saw it there, and I thought, wow, America is now interested in all their vintages. I mean, a big headline. Great vintage in Bordeaux. And so editors started to say, we ought to know more about this. You go and find out what's going on, you see. So journalists started to go and quiz wine proprietors and things. And they thought, what am I going to ask this guy? How's the weather? Can I see your cellar? And then they started to ask about grape varieties. What are those plants out there in the vineyard? And in some cases, I'm afraid the farmer would say, well, we've got some Grenache, which is which? And this is Grenache. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but it was only the bright and well-endowed producers who had studied seriously what the best grape varieties were. I mean, in Burgundy you planted Pinot Noir because you had to, but what Pinot Noir? If you went to a nursery and said, what's Pinot Noir? They'd say, ooh, you're looking for a big crop, sir? Then, largely thanks to Jancis, I would say, in the first place, varietal consciousness came in. And, well, on this side of the Atlantic, on the other side of the Atlantic, it was actually Frank Schoonmaker, who was advising Almaden in California, now extinct. And he said, why don't you put the grape varieties on the labels? And they brought out Cabernet Sauvignon. The back label said, the grape of the great French red wines of Bordeaux, and Chardonnay equivalent. And I think that, which was in the mid-60s probably, that was a moment of revolution. And then I will frankly admit that when I did the first World Atlas of Wine, I wasn't nearly aware enough of, we put everything down to terroir. And why did Pauillac taste like this and Margaux like that? Well, it could have spotted the fact that actually there's more Cabernet in Pauillac, but that came later. And it wasn't necessarily true, but all sorts of surprises. I mean, when I became a director of Chateau Latour in 1986, one of the things we did early on was we chartered a helicopter to fly over the meadow to look at other people's vineyards, and we were amazed because the further you got from the road, the less vines there were. There were great bald patches, and if you wanted a low yield per hectare, you had less vines. I mean, that's the most cynical point of view, but it's an element that nobody thinks about.
Yeah.
Well, we've all learned a great deal since then. We really have.
It must have been quite eye-opening to be taking a helicopter.
Oh, wow, astonishing.
Now we can just use Google Maps.
You have a drone.
That's right. Fabulous. And then as you said, you very much handed the baton over to Jancis for the Atlas. What do you like to do in your spare time? Do you have any spare time? What does Hugh Johnson do on a day off?
Well, I'm a gardener. I'm a keener and keener gardener. I used to, when we lived in the country in Essex, we had a big garden, and I started an arboretum. I mean, the second book that I wrote that was significant, maybe, was about trees. Because after I wrote the World Atlas of Wine, and James said to me, okay, Hugh, that worked well. What's next? You see, and I said trees. He said cheese. Oh yes, cheese and wine. That's no TR. They're not a commercial subject, but they were. And since I was involved with the RHS, the Royal Horticultural Society, and sort of started up, it turned its publications into the magazine The Garden, which was in 1975. And I love the fact that there was I in one part of London planning this new magazine called The Garden, and another part of London, not far off, in another basement with lots of cow gum, there was Colin Parnell doing Decanter. Came out at the same time.
Oh gosh.
So yes, gardening, and now a tiny London garden, but our daughter Kitty, who incidentally, I hope everybody knows, wrote that wonderful book, A Woman's Guide to Wine, Kitty Johnson. She and her husband live down in the New Forest, and so does Red, our son, who is also now in the wine business, marketing, among other things, English sparkling wine. He lives down there as well, so we've got plenty of trees around us, and I do a lot of tree planting still.
Excellent. So trees and wine.
Yeah, trees.
Trees, not cheese. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's great.